Hello, I'm Cristina Caffarra. Welcome to Escape Forward, a space where I have the pleasure of moving away from the narrow world of antitrust, which was my original domain, and the privilege of discussing the broader landscape of policy, geoeconomics with the most thoughtful thinkers and policymakers around. Last January at my Brussels conference, just 10 days after the Trump inauguration, we had a fantastic discussion on the battleground for global domination. What's ahead for Europe as the US and China fight for supremacy? It was an extraordinarily prescient conversation, which has played out indeed over the last 9 months as we watched the Trump administration wield America's power over the rest of the world, and China continued to march relentlessly towards economic hyperpower, Europe somewhat cowering in the middle, having to shore up our economic model that's faltering, facing President Trump's coercion, Chinese shock, just as we face war on the border with Russia. I'm extremely excited to have here today a key player, a key voice in that discussion, Rohit Chopra, who served, in fact, both in the first Trump administration as a commissioner at the Federal Trade Commission, and more recently in the Biden administration, of course, as head of a financial regulator, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where in fact he took multiple action against banks, credit card, financial institutions to protect consumers and small businesses against excess fees, unlawful fees, return money to the public. Above all, Rohit is recognized as one of the greats, one of the thinkers in policymaking and statecraft in the Biden administration. Welcome, Rohit. The topic for today's discussion is the new toolkit of power: finance, deal-making, champions, and more. And we are going to have a broad ranging conversation of all of the tools that we see in play now by the Trump administration, from finance to tariffs to deal-making in all directions on a huge scale, to champions, much more. And we will then pivot to Europe to consider where we are in this extraordinary time of profound global and geoeconomic transformation. Let's get straight into the substance. Taking a long view, Washington, Wall Street have been historically pretty much all singing the same tune: deregulate, break down barriers to capital flows, watch the money flow. And this ethos was exported everywhere, including, of course, to Europe. There's been an interruption, of course, with the recent Biden administration that put into place a new focus in industrial policy, competition policy, with a toolkit that was pursuing very much subsidies and ambitious aggressive antitrust enforcement and rulemaking. Now, what we see is the US administration, the Trump administration, taking equity stakes in companies. The US had long championed central bank independence, but now installing loyalists on the board of the Federal Reserve. Your former Consumer Protection Agency, Rohit, has been in effect shut down, although it's funny that the crypto industry, which is very much in favor with the White House, is trying to retain some of your rules, it would appear. So this is a whole set of issues on the finance side, financial regulation, but more than that, that is worth unpacking, especially for, I think, a mainly European audience. Would you give us your thought on this cluster of issues? Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. And of course, on both sides of the Atlantic, there are the near daily headlines about tariffs and other aspects of a trade war. But Cristina, one thing that is so underappreciated is how much what we are seeing is the result of a rethink about currency and really a feeling of resentment that many in the US political system have with the rest of the world. So we have started to see a distinct effort to try and devalue, I think, the dollar while retaining its reserve currency status. This means that the dollar would be one where there is more inflows to the US, more of an export and industrial economy here, while still enjoying the benefits of the security umbrella where sanctions and other tools can be used through the global dollar system. A lot of this is part of a broader puzzle that much of the West has been dealing with the rise of China. So I think that we are now have a number of components we're seeing, whether it's the recent unusual and highly problematic bailout of Argentina, the new incursion into the Federal Reserve Board and a rethinking of central banking, as well as how tariffs are not simply being used as a tool to reinvigorate particular industries, but a way to negotiate completely different sets of rules, including taking equity stakes in companies.
Why in particular do you think that currency matters so much in this landscape?
Well, there has long been a concern, really, by many major economies, that China manages its currency to be artificially weak, or in other words, make other currencies artificially strong. This has allowed China to position its goods globally to be cheaper, and even if those in the US or Europe are able to produce as effectively, efficiently, they lose out because of that currency dimension. So when you see on both sides of the Atlantic a rethink of the euro, the dollar, the role of US treasuries, stable coins, and monetary policy, a lot of this has a deep intersection with trade and opportunity domestically for people. If there is currency imbalances, it can rob opportunity for those who work in the goods producing sectors, both in the US, Europe, and across the world.
Just to go a bit deeper in some of that, first, you talk at the beginning about this being a manifestation of a sentiment in the US. You talk more broadly about the US, a resentment around the way in which the rest of the world, in some way, has taken advantage of the United States. Why is this resentment bubbling up now in this way? Is it not something that under the previous administration was felt? Did you feel it? Was it felt at government level? This is very much associated, of course, with the Trump administration. Where was the Biden administration on this scale?
Yeah, I think there was a diversity of views across the past decade about America's place in the world, but there was one thing that does seem to be animating today's issues, which is that a sense that the U.S., through its own contributions by its citizens and taxpayers, has really funded an enormous security umbrella for really so much of the world, but particularly Europe and NATO member states. So you have seen for many years, in some ways, annoyance by multiple U.S. administrations about the lack of defense contributions from EU member state budgets toward the defense umbrella, a sense that the U.S. is shouldering the burden of keeping the world safe. This was, of course, very much animating some of the discussions around Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so what does that mean? You have a pretty broad sense among the American public that they are fatigued. We are fatigued of overseas conflicts. And why is it that Americans are often holding the bag or paying the price financially for it? So I think what you've seen in some of the Trump officials, but particularly individuals in the financial space, is they are openly saying, openly writing in the months before they took office, perhaps countries should be paying more, not just paying more in terms of their own defense spending, but perhaps they should be grouped into a, good country or bad country. And if they are a good country, that they are going to be supporting the U.S. financially in terms of investments, as well as the purchase of U.S. treasuries, particularly long-term treasuries. And I think while the execution has not worked at all, I think that is a key motivating strain of the Trump administration and others to lower the value of the dollar, to continue President Biden's reshoring of industrial production, but also in some ways to feed and cure that resentment of Europeans simply not paying their fair share. Now, of course, I know in Europe there will be a rebuttal to this point of view, but I'm just trying to crystallize where I think there are a number of individuals in the highest levels of the U.S. government thinking right now.
And indeed, you alluded to the thinking that underpins this vision having bubbled up over time. I think we are aware of a paper that at the time was not really noticed by Stephen Myran, who is now on leave, but is the head of the Council of Economic Advisors and is on the Federal Board Reserve, which was outlining a pretty under-discovered paper nobody noticed at the time, precisely this vision of using tariffs as a way to somehow realign effectively the whole of global economics and make others, in particular Europeans, pay fair share. What is the significance in this landscape of what indeed is happening with the Federal Reserve? There has been a very public spat, of course, between the administration and the chair, and then it's culminated into the attempt by President Trump to sack Lisa Cook. What is the logic and where is it going?
That's right. So we have a few things kind of colliding here. One is a view, you mentioned Stephen Myran, now a governor on the Federal Reserve Board. He's been installed there. He previously outlined a point of view about how to address the significant imbalances in global trade, and specifically outlines a new type of accord that is described as a Mar-a-Lago Accord that would allow the dollar to have a different place in global markets, perhaps less valuable in terms of its exchange rates, but while preserving the security umbrella. And he outlines how broad-based tariffs could be used to counteract some of those effects. And to put it another way, if the U.S. is structurally, if its currency is structurally overvalued, whatever it may be, 10%, could they counteract that with a broad-based tariff with the rest of the world? Now, it hasn't gone to plan, but now they've looked to really invade, in some ways, the Federal Reserve Board. So this is important. I think Europeans sometimes don't fully appreciate, in my view, the role of the central bank in the U.S., that it has really generally been cordoned off from much of the overall economic policy making, with a real focus on monetary policy. But I think what you're seeing here is a desire to use the Fed as a weapon as well, to use the president's control of the dollar and the money supply to essentially recontour and even pick winners and losers in it. I do think this is in some cases long in the making. There has been broad discontent with the accountability and frankly, some of the results of the Federal Reserve Board. It played a pivotal role in the 2008 financial crisis by failing to regulate subprime mortgages. And in general, there is a perception that it has overall favored Wall Street interests over the real economy. So President Trump fires Lisa Cook, a governor on the Federal Reserve Board appointed by President Biden. He alleges that she engaged in some sort of mortgage fraud. Most observers and commentators have found that the allegations are pretextual, simply to find a way to knock her out, or to essentially be able to communicate that the president controls the Fed. He can come up with a reason to remove people, whether it's true or false. And even if he can't remove them, he has the specter of being able to go after them. So we are really in a totally different place now. And it seems that issues of industrial production, trade balance, concentration and antitrust, high finance, it's really all coming together right now in a lot of these fights.
And indeed, what is striking is, multiple things. One, on the tariff front, it is not an objection that one necessarily has to the use of the tool in that way, but there was at the beginning, at the time of Liberation Day, a sentiment by many that this was eccentric, that this was going to lead to significant inflation, to recession. And yet that hasn't happened at this point. And I'd be interested in your views as to where we are in that process. Then the control, again, over the central bank is not something that all object to per se, or in principle. I know of some on the Democratic side who also see it as legitimate, but it is, as you say, appears to be part of a broad effort to establish a unitary executive and the power of the president in multiple tools, in multiple ways, in every direction. So where do you think we stand in terms of, you said that the tariffs haven't worked as planned or haven't appeared to work as yet as planned. Where do you think that piece may be headed? And then we'll talk about what it does for Europe.
Yeah, so the tariffs, what we have seen, and at the time that we're taping this, there is another major development in terms of dropping trade negotiations with Canada. I think when a lot of Americans think about the problems with trade, Canada is usually not the one that comes to mind. Canada is a very similarly situated country economically to us. So some of this, you're right, it has just sounded so weird. The types of fights that are being picked. And in the backdrop of all of this, Cristina, is a court case that is working its way to the Supreme Court about whether any of these tariffs are even legal, because it's allegedly in response to some sort of economic emergency. So I think that we don't know where all of these tariffs play out, but here's what I think is permanently different. So we are seeing, for the past decade, a real shift away from the consensus of just making it seem like there's a free market. In reality, we kind of never really had a fully free market. But now you're seeing, rather than just the CHIPS Act, which was really about giving grants to be able to seed and incubate more critical industries, you're actually seeing the use of equity stakes. And I think that in some ways, this is very closely related to how tariffs are in the entire picture. The tariffs are not necessarily creating the domestic investment quickly, and they may not. But I think the use of cash infusions in companies to take equity stakes, we have now seen this, Cristina, in the case of Intel. We have seen it in rare earth, the rare earth industry. We have now recently heard news that maybe it is also going to be in the quantum computing sector. And on one hand, many people would argue that the U.S. is turning more into China, or turning more into how Europe once was. picking winners and losers. I think the story is much more complicated, but I do think that this type of tool um, may stay around, whether people like it or not.
So this is particularly salient, and I was going to really insist on this. I mean, you draw the connection between the purpose of tariff and how things are going on that front, and another tool which is being very aggressively wielded, which is indeed stakes into company, direct investment by the state into companies. That is not new because, as you mentioned, the Biden administration was big on industrial policy. That meant a lot of subsidies. But taking stakes into company is novel. It's not something the US has done, and there's been historically, or at least in the last few years, a sentiment that national champions indeed is not something that America necessarily does. We were lectured in Europe very many times that we should not be picking winners and losers, that's not, but now this is what appears to be an active effort. As you mentioned, quantum is possibly on the horizon. Chips are very big on this. So indeed, it is a vision that appears to be coming closer to a China almost intervention in capitalism.
Yeah, that's right. And I think each of them has a slightly different legal argument about why they're allowed to do it, but we're also seeing a companion effort to also incubate what some would call a sovereign wealth fund. The idea of using a large amount of capital through government-related assets that produce income and cash to be able to intervene in markets, maybe in foreign exchange markets. And I think this is giving a lot of let's call it the old school blob, a lot of concerns, but it's also giving people who do want to see more balance, more industrial production in the US, concerns about corruption and grift. To what extent are these decisions solely being motivated by political connections? And I'll argue that the recent massive bailout of the US to Argentina, where there is really not enormous high stakes or concerns about stability of the US dollar, but a fund to help stabilize exchange rates, is being used, I think, inappropriately as part of this broader statecraft. But we are hearing reports that it is those with close connections to the administration who have taken large bets through their hedge funds that they are pushing this. So I think that that's a big tension about the extent to which you can make investments at home to reshore critical industries or to make sure that you have supply for your defense industrial base, for your critical healthcare supply chain needs, well, whatever it may be. With on the other side, perhaps having the US government crown corporate royalty based on their own contributions or political influencing tactics. And I think that that's where things could go badly wrong.
So this is a natural segue because indeed, deal making is very much another major tool that this administration is very clearly seen to be using to further its own goals and certainly assert its power. We started talking about these stakes in companies, but there is a whole bigger world of deal making which is happening at the same time. We know Wall Street is at the moment wild with deals, but there is particular ways in which these deals appear to be either supported or, of course, favored by the administration, again, as ways to perhaps subdue or exert power over a certain sector. Take, for example, the media. it's one area where we see movement, considerable movement. And the message that appears to be sent to the traditional media, the traditional broadcasters, even to Hollywood, is this is who's in charge, and your deals will be allowed or not allowed depending on who essentially is sponsoring them, how close they are to the administration, which is not unusual, but it is certainly a manifest development.
Well, I think it is pretty unusual what we're seeing, and it's really dangerous. For your European audience, we had a number of incidents that were high profile in the US regarding well-known late-night TV show comedians. Many of them were actually concerned about whether or not they would still have a job, because corporate owners of their broadcast networks were trying to get mergers through the Federal Communications Commission. And we are seeing that the Federal Communications Commission is looking to put a thumb on the scale in favor of who is going to have a broadcast network that is aligned politically with the current administration. And this is absolutely dangerous. It is an enormous concern that many of us have been raising about consolidation, extreme consolidation, and media is one of the best examples. Once it can have so much power over information and it can start serving the needs and requests of the current regime. I mean, we saw in Trump's inauguration, the front row, the tech barons, those who control the flow of information. So Cristina, wouldn't even consider that a deal. I would consider that really hijacking the rule of law in order to advance a particular political agenda. And I think it's very, very dangerous. So, but the overall theme that you're saying is right, is that we are seeing many abuses in terms of how legal tools are being deployed. And I would say, including in the opposite direction, the agency I ran, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, many have raised alarm bells as to why some individuals have taken such interest in shutting off all of its investigations, shutting off all of its inspections of financial institutions, and perhaps most notably, actively dismissing court cases of existing public court trials and essentially pardoning companies. So I think that the word deal making in some ways it isn't really capturing what kind of use of power is being deployed. And I think some of it is quite dangerous for Americans here.
So before we talk about what could the sort of reaction to that be, you mentioned the big tech companies in the front row of the inauguration. And of course, there is a very clear sense that this has been, this administration is in an ambiguous relationship, to say the least, with these companies, in the sense that certainly from where we sit in Europe, these companies are being protected by the administration. And we'll talk more about that. We are being told regulation should just back off. These are the great American heroes and so on. But at the same time, at home, there is, at least to me, a sense that they are also a little bit off the hook, but on a leash. You are basically allowed to print money at the pleasure of the administration, but don't mess up. And this is a profound change from the previous administration, in which there was, of course, a very clear drive that was novel for America to address corporate power in digital space through multiple antitrust action, but through various other ways. So this is clearly something where we in Europe are at the moment thinking about how do we continue to pursue our own sovereignty in this space, continuing to enforce our laws. And then there is the further wrinkle of what appears to be a fairly unleashed brotherhood of eccentrics in Silicon Valley who talk about things, crazy stuff from the Antichrist to we need a president we need a CEO who has got absolute powers. So this again is very disconcerting, to say the very least. I'm sure you share that. But it is a development that is enormous relative to the previous administration.
Yeah, and I think to me the more noteworthy contrast is the first Trump administration. I was a federal trade commissioner. I was one of the minority commissioners. But under the first Trump administration, don't forget, Cristina, that's where we voted out a lawsuit against Facebook, Meta. That was the administration that also started
the first Google case.
The Google case. And it was very bipartisan. There was a lot of concerns about the abuse of power. And I think a lot of that was actually genuine. But now we are seeing that maybe they're just flipping a switch and seeing that these powerful entities, why break them up? Why not just hold a sword of Damocles over them?
That's exactly what it looks like.
So that they serve exactly what you want. And look, I think we're seeing that in so many different ways of how those tech CEOs and others are really bending the knee.
And before we turn to Europe, because I do want to go to Europe and discuss the predicament we find ourselves in, given this broad landscape, what you're describing is a systematic, very effective, at least seen from here, effort to wield power in multiple dimensions, which you are saying, and indeed many say, is not necessarily legal, is not legal. This is a view that many put forward. But given where things are, it's a difficult question, but where is your head when you think about what next? I mean, there is, of course, going to be a period before next election, but how do you see a response from, indeed, the Democratic Party? You're not speaking for them, but
yeah,
where is your head at that?
Well, I think I'll address both globally and domestically. The reality is that we have a serious problem globally in terms of thinking about the future of the economy and society, especially when there's so much technological development. There is no way that the U.S. is, in my view, going to be able to compete with China alone. The Chinese have a larger population. They have essentially the same or maybe even higher GDP purchasing power. They have an industrial base that is extremely advanced and increasingly technological development that I would argue is exceeding the rest of the world in now more and more sectors. So from a defense perspective and from an economic perspective, it is going to be critical for many other countries, including the U.S., to have a way in which they will steward things forward. And that is going to require Europe. And Europe is going to have to pull its weight in that as well. It is going to be, and Rush Doshi and others have been really important thinkers in how will we actually build resilience through our allies in a way that we will be able to advance prosperity for our people and not just really create more oligarchs. So that is going to take multiple forms. If I'm Europe, and this is happening, we are seeing these in global currency markets, all over the capital markets, and Frank, a sense that countries in Europe and elsewhere in the world need to diversify away from both China and the US. And I think this is going to be a tough situation because in some ways the US, Europe, others need to be thinking about supply chains and industries that we will be able to use our scale and assets to in some ways check what I see as some of China's aspiration, the Chinese Communist Party's aspirations. So for Europe, that does mean thinking through some degree of kind of technological ecosystem do they want to have. It looks from here that Brussels and European capitals simply want to accommodate big U.S. tech giants. That is not going to be a successful recipe in my mind. So you look, this is going to be tough in terms of how those who are Democrats, how they need to be responding. I could go on for a while about this, but using the same old playbook about returning back to the old way of doing things. The old way of doing things was part of getting us into the situation we are in today. The old way of doing things, which used a playbook, especially an economics playbook, that just didn't really work, that led to a massive financial crisis, that led to serious issues with opioids, digital abuses. So there is a lot of work to do on both sides of the Atlantic to figure out what are the ways we are going to manage our financial system, our trading system, and our tech and industrial ecosystems in a way that really is going to work in a world where China has growing influence.
So there's so much there, and I want to pick up distinct threads. Let me go to the European thread first, because you talk constructively about the work that Europe needs to do and the way in which Europe needs to emancipate itself. I know this sentiment that Europe needs emancipating itself is one that you've held for a while. And as you said, it is part of a growing sentiment in the US that Europe had been too reliant and too complacent. You recall at my conference earlier in January, Julius Krein created audience gasps when I asked, what do you think the Trump administration will think and do about Europe? And his fairly dismissive answer was, I don't think they'll care very much about Europe. They might go to Berlin or Paris sometime, but they won't really come to Brussels. And it played out pretty much that way. There is a sense when you talk about Europe needing to get aware of its own weight and its future need to establish itself, that we're not remotely there. And we're not. Because the reality right now is one where we feel that we get punched in the face quite a lot by the wielding of tariffs, by the coercion that has come with it. And I don't want to take too much time, but of course, Europe is vulnerable in some dimension, in several dimensions, when it comes to digital regulation or cars. There is no question that Europe will privilege lower tariffs for its car industry that employs 13 million people. And you mentioned the fact that the Europeans may have decided to go along with the digital giants is more a sense that the UK is particularly an exception, has made that decision. Others may not have made it proactively, but there is a sense that we are being punched down and told to just comply and be happy with it, or else. So that's the difficult situation, I think, where Europe finds itself. And I I would like you to elaborate a little bit on that, because I don't think it necessarily is the case that we need to accept that kind of narrative and mindset, but it seems to be difficult for us to get ourselves out of that hole where in defense we are reliant, where in digital we are a total colony, where in multiple other dimensions we are so dependent. And that's a real problem right now.
I fall in the camp of it's so important, not just for Europe, but other major economies. Of course, there's a lot of amazing and important American contributions that will be used all over Europe, companies, technologies. But I also think we want for America, for Europe to also be creating and building and frankly defending, because there is a sense politically that the US should not necessarily be the ones bankrolling or fundamentally being responsible for the security of the world. It's supposed to be a cooperation. So here's how I see it. I see very serious energy crisis in terms of costs. I see manufacturing capacity in places like Germany in decline. And I see a approach to technology and AI that is largely about accommodation rather than really forward thinking on what are really those key industries of the future. I mean, I was in my last trips to Europe, I heard about, an agenda focused on AI factories. It's really hard to even know what that means. At the end of the day, it just seems like trying to get US companies to invest and build data centers there. I'm probably oversimplifying it, but the way in which we all need to play our cards is one where we understand we cannot follow that old playbook of just drifting toward serving the interests of the financial industry and concentrated power, but instead build supply chains and an industrial structure that actually is resilient in times of serious disruptions, whether it's something like COVID or frankly, whether it's something like a financial crisis or a war. And so there's clearly tariffs are creating much more tensions around that. And we will see, and there are many in the US who worry that the damage is going to be very, very deep and permanent. But that doesn't mean that people shouldn't be thinking about how the US, Europe, and others really can be making quite a bit of shift back toward an economy that actually is serving people rather than just those at the top.
And I want a last comment, because this is really what I would like us to, you to leave us with. You mentioned a couple of times, the old playbook is not something we can go back to. It feels very much like what you're saying is it isn't coming back. It isn't coming back. The old order isn't coming back. So whatever we thought even a few years ago was the policy and the playbook indeed is obsolete now in the face of this very different landscape. What is unclear is who is actually going to generate that new playbook. What we see is, of course, a real major transformation. And the question, I guess, which remains open, and we are certainly in Europe uncertain about, not only about ourselves, but also about the United States, is where is any new playbook going to come back from?
Yeah, this is a good one. I mean, I feel that we look at the playbook, and I use that loosely, but it is essentially a consensus on how we structure global financial systems, trading systems, and really domestic regulation and tax. There was a sense that those ingredients and others is going to be what creates the most amount of growth and prosperity. And yes, it may not be distributed well, but maybe we can, give people some extra benefits or income transfers and everyone will be happy. We know that didn't work. And I think it's very important on both sides of the Atlantic to not cling to something that will not come back. And instead of reflexively criticizing any type of change that we have seen in the past 10 years, which, by the way, I served in the Biden administration. I felt those criticisms too. A just reflexive attack based on that it's not how things are always done. We are going to need to do things that were not done before. There will need to be different ways of thinking about how our economy works, and we will not be just outsourcing everything, no matter who is in power. So what is the way to do that that actually solves the serious problems people have? I tend to think that we need to be able to speak to the actual problems people are experiencing in their lives, especially when it comes to the horrible cost of living that is being felt, I think, in both US and Europe, the lack of opportunity, the lack of accountability for those in power. So, Cristina, I think the answer is that it's not going to come from one place. It's not going to come from a political party or a specific academic bent. It is probably going to be an intense fight of ideas of how this new global financial and economic statecraft will work. And whether it's thinking about the monetary system, and I think that is very key, or what our future of our trading system will be, it is a jump ball, but the rules of the game are going to change again. They will not fully revert.
This is a great place to end. On my side, as a European, I wish in particular that Europe will actually take advantage of what is now a moment of really deep weakness and need to reflect and to act, not just reflect, because we reflect quite too much. We need to act on our future. And similarly, I think that indeed, as you say, there needs to be a collective crafting of playbooks, because I do not think that this is going to be permanent. Something else will follow it, and quite what it is, we need to work on it together. But I'm very grateful for your thoughts, Rohit, and it's always such a privilege to have you in conversation. So let me thank you again for your time, and I hope everyone will enjoy it as much as I did. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.